December 1943. New York Harbor. A Liberty ship noses into a berth under cranes that move like metronomes, and a line of German prisoners, salt stiff in their coats, file toward a pier that should have looked like a nation gasping for air. It doesn't. Sodium lights wash the snow. Switchers cough once, then glide. A stevedore flicks 2 fingers in an absent salute and never breaks his count. They were told America was soft jazz chewing gum, a people without iron. They were not told about schedules that behave like laws. The first POW hears a milk truck clink bottles in the dark and feels his certainty bend. Another watches a conveyor pour grain into a waiting truck, while a clerk stamps papers in a rhythm too calm for wartime. The skyline is not dim. The rail yard is not quiet. The docks are bored, which is worse. Bored means nothing stops. They had no idea that the enemy's greatest weapon would be invisible in a battlefield trench and deafening on a winter pier. Not a tank or a fighter, but repetition, identical pallets, identical ledgers, identical gestures that add up to inevitability. They didn't know, couldn't know, from North Africa or Sicily, that a locomotive could feel like a doctrine and a clipboard like a creed. Only capture opens the curtain. Only a guarded walk between white stripes on a dock, coffee steaming somewhere to the left, a whistle answering somewhere to the right, lets the truth step forward. America has weaponized normal. And the prisoners, still counting their own footsteps, understand that they have arrived not simply in a country, but inside a machine. Spring-summer 1943. The Axis fronts. In Europe and the Mediterranean, German infantry live by rationed light and rationed stories. Propaganda reels purr, Americans drown in abundance fat with gadgets incapable of suffering. The film cuts clean steel helmets, precision optics, the Panther's gun shroud gleaming as if confidence were a finish you could polish. In the desert, mechanics coax bearings to sing with oil that should have been saved for engines. In Sicily, platoons barter wire into miracles, hitching radios to batteries that barely remember voltage. Improvisation is a virtue because scarcity is continuous. Mail from home carries the same rhythm: bombs, shortages, sirens. A loaf stretched with sawdust rumor. A bicycle tire patched until the patch is more real than the rubber. Officers preach quality as salvation: 1 Panther for 3 Shermans, 1 ace for 3 rookies, 1 perfect part to shame an assembly line. This is a theology tidy enough to survive in a foxhole. It flatters the listener. It turns every delay into patience and every shortage into purity. Between battles, they watch newsreels where the enemy is a caricature, loud, undisciplined, unserious. Chewing gum is proof. Baseball is proof. Girl singers on a stage are proof. Proof that a people who laugh cannot endure. The front agrees because the front is small, a crossroads, a hill, a ravine. War is measured in hedgerows, not in the hours of a factory a continent away. If trains are late, that is weather. If spares are missing, that is fate. The creed survives because it explains defeat as elegance under siege. And yet, there are details that do not fit. Columns of American trucks that do not thin with distance. Airfields where the morning delivers replacements without ceremony. Rations with chocolate, which feels like an insult and tastes like sleep. A sergeant jokes that the enemy fights with kitchens. Another replies that kitchens win long wars. They laugh because laughter is cheaper than doubt. So the Axis, Private, the one who will soon stand on a pier in New York, moves through his days persuaded that America cannot be serious. He cleans sand from his bolt and waits on a supply officer who waits on a railcar that waits on a promise. He cannot see the thing that will break his certainty because propaganda never films a schedule, and schedules do not pose for cameras. They laughed first because the films told them to. Newsreels in gray theaters marched certainty across the screen. A montage of American jitterbug store windows heaped with trinkets, a congress of talkers talking while soldiers waited. The narrator's voice, lacquered with superiority, made democracy sound like a disease of the jaw: too many mouths, not enough teeth. Cut to a factory floor where women riveted. The camera lingered as if to prove that a nation that put mothers on the line must be running out of men. The moral wrote itself: decadence in the aisles, indulgence in the canteens, an army padded by sugar and jazz. They mocked because the doctrine felt good in the mouth. Quality conquers quantity, will eclipses mass. Genius properly German turns scarcity into art. They quoted ratios the way priests quote verses: 1 panther for 3 Shermans, 1 ace for 3 rookies, 1 perfect gear for a crate of stamped parts. The joke traveled trench to trench. Americans fight with kitchens. The punchline: kitchens can't hold a hill. Laughter stitched over doubt like a quick seam, crude, visible, but better than the cold. Propaganda proposed a portrait of the American soldier as a consumer in uniform, soft hands, candy in the pocket, a camera's smile. The rifle would be good enough, the discipline slack enough, the spirit distracted enough to unspool under pressure. Machines would do what muscles should, and when the machines broke, and surely they would made as they were by amateurs and unions, the men behind them would have nothing left but slogans. It is easy to believe this when your world is a foxhole and your horizon is a hedgerow. Distance breeds contempt, and oceans are the longest distances of all. They mocked because their own hunger needed an answer. The front ran on coupons of luck. Bearings sang too loudly. Fuel was a rumor that sometimes arrived. A marching column knew the weight of a crust in a pocket. A platoon learned the silence that follows a dead radio. These were not just inconveniences. They were proofs of virtue, proofs that suffering refined the steel of a people who, unlike the Americans, could endure. The sermon went everywhere: we are hard, they are soft. We live by craft, they live by comfort. The creed made sense because it healed the insult of shortage. They mocked because the enemy's abundance was visible only as sin. Chocolate in a ration tin, proof of softness. Chewing gum, proof of carelessness. Coffee at dawn, proof that the enemy had not yet met winter. Trucks in a column, proof of waste. Why so many? Why not fewer, better? When your philosophy is a diamond, every pebble looks cheap. They did not notice that diamonds shatter. They mocked because they could not see systems working at a distance. A schedule never photographs dramatically. A replacement part never gives a speech. A port that unloads at 2-minute intervals is only a ledger with numbers marching too neatly to be believed. Propaganda filled the empty spaces with noise saxophones where there were conveyors dancing, where there were timetables, naivete, where there were procedures as dry and patient as stone. You can drown a truth in music if you play it loud enough, and they mocked because they were proud. Pride is the easiest ammunition in war. The magazines are always full. The private who had learned to make a radio whisper with wire would rather call that genius than admit a failure of supply. The sergeant who could tune a machine gun by ear would rather call that mastery than admit a failure of spares. The lieutenant who memorized maps would rather slash that discipline than admit a failure of transport. Pride arranged these virtues into a crown and set it on the brow of contempt. So they laughed, and laughter traveled with them, packed beside the rations, a companion on night marches, a finger against the leak of fear. It worked until the day the curtain lifted and the music slowed, and the joke found itself outnumbered by trucks that did not stop and clocks that did not lie. Sicily, July 1943. Dust like smoke, heat like a verdict. The ridge ahead is a ridge until naval guns speak. Then it becomes an argument of dirt and light. The German platoon holds a line of stone walls above a road the Allies have decided to own by sunset. The problem is not courage or marksmanship. The problem is time. Time arrives with trucks, and the Americans bring it in convoys. The fight begins the way small fights do: a first burst, a shouted range, a machine gun settling into its voice. For an hour, the mathematics waver. Then the calibers change. Offshore, a ship coughs a shell that peels the left flank from the hill as cleanly as a tin lid. Overhead, fighter bombers drop into their dives with a professionalism that feels indifferent, as if this were simply another appointment on a day full of them. The platoon leader keeps his men on the wall until the wall is a rumor. He can read maps. He can read men. He cannot read the schedule that is eating the horizon. The road below never empties. Trucks snake forward under dust roofs, military police snip and retie traffic, the way tailors fit cloth. and somewhere behind them an engineer company corrects a culvert that would have halted an army content with excuses. Field kitchens arrive like punctuation commas, not exclamation points, because commas mean the sentence continues. The German line already thinned by the sea's grammar, and the skies begins to draft backward among olive trees and stone huts. Orders fracture into suggestions. Suggestions curdle into gestures. A runner leaves and does not return because the map he carries has been edited by artillery. Capture is rarely cinematic. It is intimate, then administrative. The squad that drops into the ravine to escape a strafing run, 5 men, then 4, then 3, meets a sweep of American infantry whose discipline is quiet, whose rifles point without shaking, whose words arrive through an interpreter who keeps a pencil behind his ear. Hands lift. A rifle rattles when it hits rock. The Americans shout directions the prisoners half understand. The pistols vanish. The boots move. It is not cruelty. It is procedure, and the shock is that procedure does not pause for triumph. At the collection point, the wounded go one way and the rest go another. Water appears in canteens without debate. Cigarettes are offered and refused and offered again. A medic checks a pulse and a tongue depressor tastes like wood and soap. The prisoners wait under a tarp where shade equals mercy. Beside them, a table accumulates papers as methodically as the trucks accumulate miles. The interpreter asks for names, ranks numbers. The pencil records answers that will cross an ocean while their bodies follow by slower means. Night folds over the ridge, and the Americans switch to lamps that do not shout their position. The convoy organizes itself around the prisoners as if the prisoners were simply cargo bales with paperwork. The first leg is to a beachhead stockade wire sentries a tent, where a loud generator studies the mood and decides to keep working. A Red Cross badge moves through the dark like a polite star. The prisoners who expected roughness are disarmed by boredom instead. Boredom proves scale. Boredom proves confidence. From stockade to port, from port to hold, the choreography continues. The ship is not a ship to them. It is a timetable with a hull. In the morning, they hear that another unit surrendered 2 miles inland after the road out became a procession of ambulances and bulldozers. In the afternoon, they learn that a nearby airstrip went from dirt to serviceable in a day. Serviceable is a new kind of threat, not spectacle but competence that multiplies. The untold problem, the one the prisoners can now name but not solve, is that they have been fighting an enemy that treats friction like a design flaw. Where the Axis lives by improvisation, the Americans live by anticipation. Where one army writes poetry about endurance, the other writes checklists. And on a hot Sicilian road, captured between the grammar of sea and sky, a few dozen men discover how a schedule can end a story. It does not begin with a miracle. It begins with boredom engineered on purpose. In 1941, before most Americans could find Tobruk on a map, quartermasters with pencils and patient tempers started turning chaos into paper, then turning paper into trucks. They went to railroad men who knew how to make time move in one direction. They went to grocers who understood freshness, to mail clerks who worshipped zip codes before the country had names for them, to union stewards who could stand 1,000 people on a floor and make them move like one hand. They took the mess of democracy arguments, committees, town halls, clipboards, and shaved it until it could pass through a loading dock without a snag. The impossible idea is modest: teach a continent to behave like a depot. Take a farm state and make it a larder with tracks. Take a river city and make it a hinge. Take a shipyard and make it a metronome that beats in hull numbers. The military words G4 Service Forces Warshipping Administration sound bureaucratic, but the intent is lyrical: abolish surprise. Build a future where the right thing arrives before it is needed, and the wrong thing never shows up at all. Humane treatment is not a separate ethic tacked on later. It is the same idea applied to people. The Geneva-Convention is a supply chain for dignity. Rations medical care. Pay letters, these are not favors. They are scheduled. When the first POW stockades rise on American soil, they go up from standardized plans, the way barracks rise, the way canneries rise. Sinks at this height. Windows at this spacing. Mess tables at this capacity. Orderliness is mercy's cousin. The American soldier lives inside this system and learns its elegance without ever calling it that. He knows his socks will be dry because someone designed the laundry route to intersect with the truck turnaround. He trusts coffee because coffee is never late. He believes in his sergeant because the sergeant believes in the requisition. Improvisation exists, but as a hobby. The day job is following a checklist written by people who loved checklists more than sleep. Those people, the logisticians, the factory planners, the clerks with the graphite-stained fingers, are the quiet heroes the camera forgets. Their names don't look good on a theater marquee. Their work looks like boredom. But when the boredom breaks, men die. The system scales outward. A fort in the Midwest becomes a model for a camp in North Africa, which becomes a model for an airfield in Sicily, which becomes a template for a port in France. Everything repeats. Pallets, crates, stencils, forms. Repetition is the miracle because repetition produces memory, and memory produces speed. The day a loading crew can close its eyes and still do the job, you have won something deeper than a battle. You have won the calendar. Kindness, too, is repeated. The POW camp's canteen is stocked because a purchasing officer in St. Louis has a vendor list that lives in his desk like scripture. The movie night works because a projectionist at a stateside base wrote notes on a card about bulb life and belt tension, and someone read them. Medical protocols travel in envelopes. Treatment becomes habit. A prisoner's blood pressure is logged because someone made a column on a form, and someone else cannot bear to leave a column blank. The impossible idea is that a democracy, argumentative, untidy, allergic to uniforms, can put on a uniform when it must. Not to silence itself, but to orchestrate itself. Train whistles, punch clocks, clipboards, lunch whistles, cranes, a mechanical liturgy. The enemy sees jazz and thinks chaos. The prisoners arrive and hear a different music, swing time as factory time, syncopation as shift change, improvisation, tucked away in a brass's back pocket, while the rhythm section keeps immaculate time. It is not glamorous. It is not sentimental. But it is the most American of inventions, a system that converts abundance into predictability, and predictability into power, and smuggles decency into the plan, as if it were just another line item to be met on Wednesday at 0900 hours. The numbers are not abstractions. They are scenery. A rail yard that switches 1,000 cars a day is not big. It is a guarantee that the truck park 2 miles away will never wait longer than coffee cools. A port that measures ship turnaround in hours, not days, is not efficient. It is a promise that the artillery on a hill in Italy will not run out of tubes before dark. The secret sauce is not one machine or one factory. It is a choreography that makes scale feel local. Start with production. Detroit learns to speak in tonnage and decimals. Willow Run stops being a rumor and becomes a corridor, wings on hooks, fuselages on jigs, engines lined like prayer books. A plant in California names days by launch numbers. A shipyard in Oregon mistakes a forest for raw material and is grateful for the error. The country is not rich in the way the Axis imagined, fattened and lazy. It is rich in repeatable steps. If a rivet pattern works on Monday, it will work on Friday in 3 other places, because the drawing is on onion skin paper and the tooling is in a crate stamped twice. Distribution turns this bounty into certainty. Highways become arteries. Railroads become nerves. Truck parks become knuckles. The War Shipping Administration does math on chalkboards, erases, does it again. And the result is a convoy cadence that ignores weather as a matter of principle. Traffic control evolves from a whistle and a hand to a doctrine, green routes, priority cargoes, MP units, who treat time like private property. If you arrive early, you are wrong. If you arrive late, you are wrong. If you arrive exactly when the form predicted, you are invisible, which is perfection. Wealth shows itself as redundancy. 2 cranes where one would do. Spare generators in crates with the lids already loosened. Tires stacked in shadows like fruit. An Axis engineer would call it waste. An American foreman calls it margin. Margin is speed's bodyguard. Margin is why a storm becomes an anecdote instead of a report. Margin is why a machine coughs once and then carries on. Information is the binding agent. Requisitions do not vanish into cabinets. They root. Warehouse cards don't sit. They travel with the pallet. A failed bearing becomes a data point, which becomes a purchase order, which becomes a crate arriving 3 weeks later, as if it had always meant to. When the system works, no one claps. That is another secret. Applause is for spectacles, and this war is fought to make spectacle unnecessary. Money here is not gold bars. It is credit extended to the future. Bonds buy hours. Taxes buy standardization. Standardization buys speed. Speed buys mercy. The humane treatment that astonishes POWs, the pay script, the canteen stock. The doctor who checks a pulse before asking a name flows from the same aquifer that fills the fuel tanks and the bakery ovens. A nation that can feed soldiers well can feed prisoners decently. Not because of softness, because of surplus disciplined into routine. If you want a single image for the secret sauce, do not stare at a tank. Watch a switchman with a lantern at 3 a.m. The lantern arcs the points. Throw a string of cars, eases onto a siding, without a squeal, because the rail has been greased on schedule. In another town, a baker pulls loaves from an oven whose temperature never lies. Somewhere else, a clerk stamps a form in the exact square made for that stamp, and the ink dries, while the truck backs to the dock. This is the ritual. This is the spell. An Axis prisoner looks around and thinks none of this is heroic. And then he understands that is the point. Heroism is expensive. Boredom properly engineered is cheaper. It buys mornings, and mornings compound into victory. The journey begins with the clatter of cuffs on canteens and the smell of canvas warmed by sun. A beachhead stockade, then a pier with ropes thick as a man's wrist, then the belly of a ship repurposed from commerce to conveyance. The prisoners file aboard past ladders marked with chalked numbers through corridors where bulkheads echo boots into a single anonymous footstep. The paperwork comes first, names, ranks, serials, then a ladle of stew in a mess where the benches bolt to the deck, and the bowls are dented by 100 other voyages. The ship is a schedule with a keel, days fold into one another. The sea writes its slow grammar across men who once measured time in barrages. The guard routines are quiet and repetitive. The doctor's rounds are as predictable as the dawn that finds the horizon in the same place every morning. They watch deck crews move in a dance of ordinariness, coil, stow, secure, until ordinariness begins to feel like a doctrine. A convoy slides on the rim of sightline. More hulls than a man can number without losing count, each one just another answer to the question. How much? Then America arrives by smell before sight, coal smoke thawing, river a fan of cold air that tastes like iron and electricity. Harbor lights bloom even before the sun is honest about its intentions. Tugs push the transport into a berth with practiced nudges. Lines snake to bollards. A crane bows and rises without glance or drama. The gangway snaps to the lip of the hatch like a thought completing itself. Manhattan or Norfolk or Boston, names don't matter yet. The choreography does. Somewhere a whistle talks to a second shift that never learned how to quit. On the dock, the rhythms multiply. Freight rolls on tractors that never idle. Forklifts nose their burdens into neat, obedient stacks. The prisoners still in column glimpse the domestic background they did not expect to exist during a war. A woman setting a child's scarf just so. A baker's window fogged with winter. A streetcar dinging itself through an intersection thick with uniforms and overcoats. The guards hurry no one. The forms hurry everyone. An officer speaks to a port foreman who watches 3 clocks at once and listens to none. The prisoners are counted, recounted, chalked, and handed to a railway timetable. Rail cars wait with their doors open like mouths, inside benches, above racks for packs. At each end, a soldier whose expression says he has ridden this line enough times to upgrade boredom into expertise. The locomotive inhales and the train slides through a landscape that reorganizes the word distance. Steel mills flare against afternoon gray. A river-bound raft of logs bunch like cattle behind a boom. Yards bloom with grain elevators that breathe and breathe and breathe. The prisoners had learned to distrust abundance in photographs. Abundance as panorama is harder to argue with. The guard pours coffee from a battered pot, checks the lid, screws it down, habit, not theater. Towns pass by with reassuring sameness, depots painted in railway colors. Hardware stores whose windows display tools the front could have used last year. Posters with war bond icons that smile without smirking. Baseball diamonds asleep under frost. At a junction, the train pauses to let a priority freight storm through flat cars saddled with tanks under tarps, gondolas full of steel hopper cars that speak coal in the language of gravity. A switchman with a lantern steps exactly where the ballast remembers his boots. The line flexes, accepts, delivers. The prisoners watch a signal drop to green and feel the tug of a logic that ignores them entirely. And the ignoring itself is a lesson a nation that does not stare at you is busy. Meals are served with an efficiency that feels like a challenge to cynicism. The bread is fresh. The stew is palatable. There is coffee when there should only be water. Guards pass along cigarettes with a matter-of-factness that empties the gesture of pity. A smoker who refuses at first tastes one anyway and memorizes the quiet of the moment as an offense and a relief. Across a siding, schoolchildren wave, and a few prisoners wave back despite themselves. The train resumes. In fields, tractors put up perfect rows that do not understand the word interrupted. The last leg breaks from main line to branch from branch to a spur that ends inside a fence. The camp hovers first as geometry rectangles and right angles, and then as a place watchtowers with ladders, barracks with numbers, a mess hall built to a stencil. The train sighs, brakes take their patient breath, and an officer with a clipboard begins to translate men into entries. They disembark. A sergeant points, men obey, the column turns left where it is told to turn left. The air smells of disinfectant and soup. Somewhere close, a generator holds a note so steady that silence would now sound broken. The journey to the camp has taught them geography. The gate will teach them routine. They look back one last time down the track they came on. The signal already lifts, impatient to be ordinary again. The locomotive answers with a restrained cough. The flat horizon beyond the fence is unremarkable in every direction, a tabula rasa on which the machine of custody will write its lines. Trial by fire, they expected, meant a last stand in a ruined street. Instead, it meant being carried across an ocean by a schedule and set down like freight in a place that weaponizes predictability. The lesson is not cruel. The lesson is not kind. The lesson is that the machine works. The first morning begins at the same minute it will begin tomorrow. A whistle, a call, boots on boards, the quick tidy of blankets that smell faintly of new lumber and bleach. Roll call, names, then numbers spoken into the air, as if the air keeps records. A medic stands nearby with a clipboard, not because he expects drama, but because today someone will need aspirin, and aspirin is a supply item, and supply is how this place thinks. Breakfast trays sliding along rails, ladles measured by muscle memory. Oatmeal, bread, coffee, the holy trinity of predictable calories. No one hurries, but nothing dawdles. The dining hall hums with the same unremarkable competence as the generator that guards the lights from weather. A guard offers seconds to a man who once wrote letters home about starving Americans. The man hesitates, then nods, then tries not to enjoy the taste. Realization does not strike like lightning. It seeps like heat into bones that expected cold. Orientation follows. Work details posted with chalk on a board clean enough to shame an operating theater. Agriculture, sawmill, cannery, maintenance. Each crew has a leader who knows where they're going because he went there yesterday and the day before. In the infirmary, a nurse checks a blood pressure and records it in a column that also holds yesterday's number and will hold tomorrow's. A Red Cross badge moves among the cots. A translator moves beside it like a shadow. A man with a cough is told to rest. Another with a splinter is told to show up at a time that will be honored. In the workshop, prisoners meet the American idea of repair throw parts at a problem until the problem is embarrassed. The bin labeled spare is larger than the bin labeled broken. Tools hang on silhouettes painted black, each a promise that absence will be noticed. A corporal explains torque in slow, careful words. A prisoner nods and pretends not to be impressed. When a generator hiccups, a replacement yawns awake from a crate whose lid was already loose. Downtime is treated as a moral failure. The system purrs on. The canteen is a revelation disguised as a store. Cigarettes, razor blades, Notebooks, chocolate, sometimes a glass bottle of soda so cold the hand aches. Payment is script camp money that buys not freedom but routine with privileges. A line forms and dissolves without policing because the board says the canteen closes at 1800 and the board is obeyed the way weather is obeyed. A prisoner buys a bar of soap and discovers that clean smells like power. Mail day arrives on a schedule that the guards can recite without looking. Letters censored still carry the handwriting of home, and the act of handing them over is ceremonial without being sentimental. A man holds an envelope as if it were water after thirst. Another writes by the window, the nib scratching like an insect, promising a mother that he has enough to eat, that his boots fit, that the guards are dull in the best ways. The censors read later, nudging aside moments that should not travel, but they do not slow the flow because the flow is the point. Evenings are the axis of realization. Movie night, a projector whirs the belt true, the bulb new. The film is not propaganda, but competent melodrama, and competence is its own propaganda. The audience laughs where laughter is fair and quiet, where quiet is respectful. Afterward, lights out happens at the minute printed on a schedule, and darkness arrives as a favor, not a punishment. Sleep in a place that keeps its promises feels treacherous and necessary. One day, a storm punishes the camp. Rain slants like discipline. Wind worries the eaves. A transformer in town dies with a sound like an oath. The camp's lights blink once. The generator clears its throat, finds its note, holds it. Kitchens keep their temperature. The infirmary keeps its heartbeat. The board with tomorrow's work crews keeps legible chalk. In the morning, coffee is on time, and the film of water on the parade ground has retreated to the places the drainage plan intended. The prisoners look at one another and admit with their eyes what their pride will not yet speak. Systems are stronger than weather. A chaplain's service borrows the mess hall for an hour, and belief takes its place beside logistics without argument. Later, a baseball scrimmage needs outfielders and the line between guard and guest blurs into laughter that costs no one anything. The ball arcs into a sky that has not noticed the fence. A catch is made. Applause, small, sincere, rolls across uniforms that mean different things until they only mean men. The realization becomes a sentence a man can say out loud, we misjudged them. Not because they are kinder than we thought, though some are, but because they are more organized than we can stand. The enemy we invented was soft. The enemy we meet is scheduled. Dignity, it turns out, can be mass-produced, and mercy can ride on the same trucks as munitions. A prisoner folds his blanket at the exact angle of the demonstration and catches himself wanting to meet the standard. He blushes, then shrugs, then meets it anyway. Late in the war, 1944 into 1945, the camp does not grow harsher. It grows more itself. The routines densify. The board's chalk feels permanent. News trickles in with the mail fronts, bending, cities burning, names becoming history. Inside the fence, breakfast remains breakfast, work remains work, lights out remains a promise kept. The men who arrived this late cross the threshold more quickly, chilling from contempt to comprehension, because the evidence is relentless. No speech could have argued them into it. Only 1,000 small competences could. On the night before a new transport of prisoners is due, a guard checks the spare belts for the projector. In the workshop, a wrench goes back to its silhouette. In the infirmary, a nurse draws a line in a column and writes a number with careful digits. The generator hums. The schedule sleeps and dreams in straight lines. And somewhere between the barracks and the fence, a man who once laughed at chewing gum understands that the taste he cannot forget is the flavor of a system that does not break. Shock travels strangely in war. It does not always sprint to the front line with a headline. It seeps by rumor, by letter, by the posture of a man who returns from captivity quieter than he left. Among Axis units, the tale of America as machine becomes a story whispered in dugouts and on rail sidings while trains wait for coal that will not come. They have switchboards for everything someone says. They have lists for mercy, says another meaning. The Geneva rules enforced by people who look bored and therefore dangerous. The laughter that once traveled with the column starts needing effort. You can still tell the joke Americans fight with kitchens, but you must push it uphill. Morale is not just courage, it is prediction. A soldier stands straighter when tomorrow looks like a map he can read. The POW shock steals that map. If the enemy can turn breakfast into doctrine and rail yards into fate, then the battlefield is only the last room in a house that has already been built. The Axis sergeant, who once believed that a single panther could redeem a sector, begins to suspect that sectors are not the unit of account anymore. Hours are. And the Americans infuriatingly appear to own more hours than anyone else. Letters from camps contribute their own gravity. Not all get through and censors trim the edges, but enough arrive to alter the weather. We eat, writes a son who expected hunger. We work, we are paid in script, there are inspections. A father reads that line in a village where bread is a cue and thinks thoughts that do not sing with propaganda. He tells the neighbor at the pump the enemy is not soft, the enemy is organized. Word by word, morale loses a prop, the belief that superiority of spirit can outrun shortage forever. On the line, measurable things tilt. Units that counted on an opponent's clumsiness discover an opponent's patience. Artillery shells come when the map says they will not, when the weather allows nobility. Infantry rotates before exhaustion grows theology. Trucks arrive with tires that match each other. Fuel cans arrive with lids that fit. Replacements arrive trained to the same jokes and the same checklists. The Axis soldier notices sameness and begins to understand it as power. His own sameness is fatigue. Theirs is design. The shock also rearranges fear. Once fear obeyed the logic of spectacle bombers blotting a sky tanks cresting a ridge. Now fear accrues to quieter things. A timetable pinned to a post. A convoy that does not thin in the mirror. The knowledge that if this unit is destroyed, another with the same name, only a number changed, will arrive with the same boxes and the same pencil marks and continue the sentence without a wobble in the voice. Heroics do not disappear. They become expensive luxuries measured against a ledger that punishes drama. In briefings, officers still sketch arrows and read from reports that heat the blood. But behind the music, a metronome clicks throughput turnaround rate of effort. The men notice. They notice that American mistakes produce delays. Their own mistakes produce absence. Delay is survivable if the machine absorbs it. Absence is not. So morale shifts from a faith in exception to a dread of averages. Averages favor the side that multiplies. When surrender comes for some piecemeal local, the act feels less like collapse and more like physics. Not because they run out of courage, but because they run out of mornings that promise a different kind of day. The POW shock has done its work. It has replaced the Axis myth of American frivolity with an unwanted respect, and respect is a solvent. It begins at the edges where jokes used to live and works inward, until even pride must admit that a hum can be louder than a hymn. And the hum maddeningly does not tire. After the war, the fences come down, the trains run in the other direction, and the machine that carried men into captivity returns them to the ruins they imagined they would never see again. Some write memoirs. Some speak in interviews decades later, their voices frayed to honesty. The quotes do not agree on politics or guilt. They converge on rhythm. I expected anger, one former prisoner says, but what I met was administration. He means the ledger that made sure a blanket reached a bed and a letter found a mother. He does not excuse the war. He reports its infrastructure. They had a schedule for everything, even for kindness. Another remembers the first American port. At night there was light, he says, as if the city had decided darkness was an error to be corrected by procedure. He describes cranes that did not complain and men who did not hurry because they did not need to. If boredom is a weapon, he adds, they had perfected it, from a man who worked in a cannery detail. We were paid in paper money we could spend only on small things, and the small things were always there. Soap, needles, cigarettes. I began to think decency was a kind of inventory. He does not romanticize the guards. He increments them. They were dull, and dullness was mercy. A mechanic talks about the workshop tools had places. Absence was visible. When a generator coughed, its twin was already awake. In our army, improvisation was bravery. In theirs, prevention was duty. He pauses. It is difficult to be brave against prevention. One tells the story of the storm. Lights blinked once. Then the generator answered. Where I came from, he says, we made poetry out of endurance. They made procedure out of weather. He laughs without pleasure. Their poetry was a checklist. Not all voices soften. A few are bitter, convinced that comfort seduced men into forgetting what had been done to their cities and families. But even bitterness concedes the central thing. We misjudged them, says a veteran who fought in Italy and spent a year in an American camp. We thought abundance meant softness. It meant margin. Margin is the enemy of heroism and the friend of victory. From a letter kept by a local historical society, written by a man repatriated in 1946. America is not a giant, he writes to his wife. It is 1,000 little giants who agree on the time. He cannot forgive. He can only measure. They have decided to be punctual about everything. And from a final voice older now asked by a student what he learned in captivity, that normal is a weapon. When you can aim it, he says. They aimed it at dawn and at supper, and at the exact minute a train should leave. We fought with speeches. They fought with Thursdays. These are not confessions of love or absolution. They are the reluctant mathematics of men who saw a country weaponize predictability and then mass-produce grace alongside ammunition. The machine did not sing. It hummed. It did not boast. It repeated. The last word belongs not to a general or a minister, but to a private who remembers a guard checking a list before lights out and finding everything as it should be. I slept, he says simply, and I understood why we would lose.